Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented her third consecutive budget yesterday. Now, 6 years ago, cut back to 2020, Nirmala Sitharaman delivered the longest budget speech in India's history. Back then, in 2020, it was 2 hours and 42 minutes long. But it was filled with excitement. The new tax regime was introduced. The dividend distribution tax was abolished. Deposit insurance was hiked from 1 lakh to 5 lakh rupees and a lot more. But this year, the budget speech was much shorter at just 1 hour and 23 minutes. But excitement seemed absent yesterday. Some call it boring by some accounts. Others call it conservative and not as energizing as what India had apparently become accustomed to, especially compared to the year before, last year, 2025, when sweeping tax rebates propped up consumption to as high as 60% of India's GDP. Now, the finance minister has kept key tax slabs virtually unchanged this year. A hike in security transaction tax for futures and options seemed to have spooked market participants who are questioning the timing of such a move when foreign investors are already on exit mode. Now, yesterday, Nifty 50 slipped as much as 2 1/3%. Sensex lost more than 1,800 points in the Sunday special trading day on budget day. Budget 2026 was expected to focus on job creation, providing a fillip to manufacturing and creating a scenario for foreign capital to come to India. Some argue it did not live up to expectations, but others say boring is not bad, conservatism is not complacency, and budget energy is that of a test match. Slow but sure singles, not necessarily hitting the ball out of the park, being the need of the hour. Now, some of the highlights of Budget 2026 include a capital allocation increase to 12.2 lakh crore rupees, component manufacturing incentives of 40,000 crore rupees, an MSME booster of 20,000 crore rupees, and continuity of the India semiconductor mission with a new 2.0 avatar. Now, add to that the fiscal glide path of 4.4% deficit target for this year, reducing to 4.3% next year, and a debt to GDP ratio of 50% by 2030-31 are all on expected lines. Artificial intelligence got a shot in the arm with the tax holiday for cloud infrastructure, investments in India, and safe harbor clause for the IT sector, all being seen as welcome moves. But no expansion to PLI schemes, no mention of employee-linked incentives, and silence on climate financing have dampened the sentiment. While Prime Minister Modi hailed the budget as reform-oriented one, no big-ticket announcements by the finance minister made Budget 2026 perhaps the least memorable one in recent years. So let's decode the numbers and let's really delve deeper into the math behind Budget 2026. Joining me on the show is Arvind Virmani, member NITI Aayog. Dr. Virmani, thank you so much for your time, sir. First up, straight off the bat, according to you, is Budget 2026 indeed a growth and reform-led budget, or have we missed out on an opportunity to deliver to the rising aspirations of India, sir?
I think of fast, sustained, inclusive growth. So, what are the elements of it? So, one is macroeconomic stability. Everybody, you'll recall for 50 years we all talked about macroeconomic stability.
Right.
Now we have that framework and we have stuck to it. So that we now take for granted, but it's very important to note it. And you know, when we had a shock in the pandemic, as a result of the shock, you have fiscal effects all over the world, and now we brought it back down. So this commitment and faith of the government in macro stability is very important underlying foundation on which everything rests. The second part, which of course has accelerated over the last 3 months or so, it's happened over time before also, the IBC, GST is one and so on, but it has accelerated, but it has two parts, right? There is a structural reform part, which is the part which has accelerated, and there is a process reform which is going on, like decriminalization, etc., which is goes on. So the budget does take up these issues because it can only do so within the items which are under its preview, right, which is taxation and the financial sector. So in taxation, we had the income tax law. and the rules and the forms, etc., have to be built, and they have to be simple. People often complain that between the law and the actual application there's a gap, but so the finance minister has tried to ensure that that simplification is goes down to the ground. And similarly on financial sector, last budget had announced that financial sector, non-financial sector would happen outside, which has been happening, and the financial sector would be done within the government, within the finance ministry, which is right because it's under them. And so this high level committee on banking reforms and the other committee on non-banking stuff. So these both process structural reform announcements in the sense of committees and process will have effects. So I think these will actually promote what I have said, the sustained fast economic growth. There are also aspects of employment, etc., which we can discuss, which relate to inclusiveness. So in the budget speech, there are elements of the importance of skilling.
Right.
I have a one-line thing that skills,
Go ahead,
jobs and skills are two sides of the same coin, and secondly, the importance of services in generating employment is recognized and showing that how important it is.
Sure, Dr. Virmani. Some will argue that perhaps not enough has been done for job creation in budget 2026, but we leave that for later. I want to understand from you the fiscal deficit financial year target at 4.4%, dipping to 4.3% next year, and we are looking at possibly, the roadmap to 2030-31 with a debt to GDP ratio of 50%. I want to understand from you, Dr. Virmani, are we looking over the next 5 years at more tax revenue for the government or less government expenditure on schemes? How do we attain that debt to GDP ratio?
Yeah, so getting down the fiscal deficit means both, right? You have to reduce expenditure, rather increase expenditure at a slower rate than the GDP and increase taxes or disinvestment at a faster rate. So I think there was an expectation last budget that or perhaps it even said that they were drawing up a slew of proposals for disinvestment. I think those probably have been done by now, and the pace of disinvestment will pick up, which is why some people have noticed the difference between the net debt mentioned and the gross. So the difference would be the privatization revenues. So I think what the importance of a flight path, which the finance minister has been clear. I said this last budget also, the ministry has been very clear that they will follow the flight path which had been laid out several budgets ago. I think the previous finance commission had approved that and suggested it, and we followed that since then. Now what is the macroeconomic importance of this? In a period of uncertainty, generally if there is fiscal restraint, this gives more opportunity to the monetary authorities to address monetary policy towards the shocks, right? So if monetary policy needs to be loosened, keeping on that flight path or whatever you want to call it, of the fiscal deficit and the debt GDP goals, then gives enough room for the central bank to address it. And that globally, across the world, across time, we have seen is the best way actually to address these kind of shocks, which are external shocks. External meaning coming both from outside the country, but also external to the, they are not related to domestic policies as such. They are, for example, drought
tariffs.
Shock or climate shock, the external shocks in that sense.
Right.
So that's the importance of sticking to the
Dr. Virmani, just a few minutes ago, you were in fact talking about jobs and skilling being, two sides of the same coin. I want to now get your view on the MSME sector, because we've seen there have been critical reductions in import duties, which are going to lead to better export value for India and a cumulative budgetary allocation to the tune of about 20,000 crore rupees. Sir, with this outlay, how soon can it, in your opinion, lead to real job creation?
So you have to see that, in MSMEs we have some sectors or sub industries which are have very high quality, which are exporting to the world, like certain types of handicrafts, textile items, etc. But what again the Honorable Prime Minister has emphasized is that we need to raise the quality of the whole system, the question is, what is the thing? We've had several programs to provide technology, etc., but it's a package. So it has to be both the skills have to be provided, where much more emphasis being given now. The capital investment has to go with it, because technology doesn't come in the air. It is often embodied in the manufacturing process, which means machines, corresponding skills, corresponding components which go into it, right? So all this requires more risk capital.
Sure.
So that is where that fund which you mentioned, which is in this budget, that equity fund will provide this aspect which perhaps has been missing. People talk about credit to MSMEs, but that credit is really working capital. So the idea is that all this stuff which has to be done together, skilling, new types of components, machinery, etc., requires increasing their ability to take risks. Of course, for startups, we have already been providing many funds, but perhaps this gap was seen in MSMEs to help them with this missing link, so to say, because it's a whole package. So I think that will help them take these risks of improving their quality, because once you improve the quality, you also need to charge higher prices.
Sure.
Right? So there is a little bit of risk which has to be taken by every MSMEs to when they are improving the quality. So that is the idea, to provide them with the risk capital, which will kind of help them along with all these other programs which are already there.
Okay, and let's talk about the risk cushion, sir, because at some level one also must understand the China factor. So we also heard Budget 2026 try and offset rare earth dependence on China. Do you think, by way of course of tax concessions on importing critical machinery which goes into mining of these critical minerals, but overall, do you think this also helps us not just offset our dependence on China, but also make us more competitive as far as our exports to, let's say, the US are concerned in the advent of the US tariff threat?
Well, there are two very different questions, because rare earth dependence is a problem for every country in the world, right? There is one country which has the processing technology and the processing manufacturing system. Processing is part of manufacturing in the way I look at it. The actual processing, not the minerals. So processing, 80 to 90% of rare earths are processed in one country. So that's a very, very high risk. It's a monopoly basically, which is a very high risk for every buyer. So this is not an India problem. This is not a US problem. This is a problem for the world. So various alternatives, various ways are being tried. The countries fortunately recognize, all of us, we have to do it together, because you cannot take a monopoly which 80-90% which controls the processing system, which controls 70% of the rare earths minerals as they are mined today. Of course, there are alternatives. So what we are doing is filling in the gaps in our own system.
Okay.
But eventually everybody will have to cooperate. As you know, our foreign minister, external affairs minister is traveling to the US to discuss with other countries, including the US, what to do. But we have to, just as with reforms, we may do external FTAs, etc., but you also have to do your own reform. So the corridors which are being suggested, changes in mining laws, changes in the ability of companies to recycle rare earths, to extract the rare earth back from the materials, etc. That whole policy structure and the infrastructure has to be built to kind of accelerate this process of creating alternative sources of metals.
Right.
And I think, again, as mentioned by Honorable PM, the magnets, which are critical to so much of industry.
Of course, so there is, of course, the domestic side, but to the question of export competitiveness, especially with regard to FTAs and offsetting US tariffs, talk to us about the importance of, let's say, industrial parks that you had just mentioned some time back.
So now that is really the issue is of industrial policy and many different parts of the thing, but I'll just mention a few. We have been talking, the PLI came years ago, right? It started several years ago. FTAs are first, if I remember correctly, our first FTA with a developed country was with Australia, I think 3 years or so ago. So these are all elements of the industrial policy which all have to fit together. The reforms which are accelerating, which we went and looked at. Of course, the infrastructure had been improving for some times, but some new elements which are mentioned in the budget, for example, local infrastructure. So one of the things we found is that on our travels was that the mega parks and all were being set up, but the historical or the legacy industrial areas were being relatively neglected. So the budget has tried to correct that. So the industrial policy has many elements, and FTAs is one part of it. And the whole idea is to de-risk, right? To develop resilience in manufacturing, so that no country, in a sense, one country can disrupt.
Okay.
So we've had different disruptions, right? Rare earths disruption came from one country. Import tariffs came from another country.
Sure.
So you need a industrial policy which has many elements. I mean, we don't have time to go into all elements of it, but that is part of the process which is going on now for several years. And as we discover new gaps in a way, we try to fill them. You've already, just to remind you, the reforms are not only at central level but also at the state level. Again, Honorable PM has talked about them earlier, how and the economic survey, what I have been surprised personally is this data which I had seen earlier, that 76% of the individual reforms which had been identified at the state level have already been done, at least from the information given by state. So the point is, all these elements go into making an industrial policy which will be successful, and that is our response to these kind of disruptions coming from individual countries.
All right, and what about making our policy also future ready, sir? My final question to you is around AI infrastructure. All that we heard in Budget 2026, is it enough to make India AI ready by the turn of the decade, sir?
So AI is a completely new field, right? So what we had talked about, industrial policy is going to produce results in the next 10-15 years. I'm confident of it. The structure which we have already set up, and we keep refining. AI, quantum, etc. Have long lags, right? So it will probably take at least 10 years to get to a stage where it is actually producing profits and productive goods and services, right? Not all, but we can't wait till then. It can't be produced in one day. It takes time. So what our approach is to set up the policy framework, to provide the public goods which are needed. We've all discussed UPI as a public good for digital, but for AI research, for example, the key thing which we learnt was that they require huge amounts of computing power, and for an ordinary professor in a university cannot get it. So this scheme was launched to provide computing for AI research as a public service, right? So these are the kind of things, but they are new. It's not obvious. It is not something which you can say, hundreds of advisors will tell you the same thing.
Right.
Because AI is so new, because the economics of AI is new.
Sure.
So it's like that famous phrase, crossing the stream by touching, feeling the stones at the bottom.
Right.
So, the AI providing the public services which will help accelerate this process, and then of course creating the environment which the private sector will then take forward and produce the products and services which will actually make profits, which will give jobs.
Of course. Well, let us leave it at that for now. Dr. Virmani, as always, pleasure having you here with us on News9, and thank you so much for all that input.